Earlier we talked about how this isn't really a plot-driven story, how it's a character-driven story, at least in my opinion. We don't have real dramatic events moving the narrative forward. It kind of depends on the characters, right? We're just eavesdropping on them. All we have is the dialogue, and all dialogue is one character speaking to another character. So let's start to think about what these characters are like. Are they flat? Are they round? Are they static? Are they dynamic? You might be getting sick of hearing those terms, but this is our final week of the fiction unit, so you won't have to deal with them for too much longer. And you don't have to apply them to every single character, but when we're talking about stories and we're thinking about the main characters, I think it's, this is an intro to lit class, so it helps to sort of think about these things in kind of a nuts and bolts sort of way. So if we look at the man, is he flat or round? Is he static or dynamic? And I don't really know. It's tough to tell about characters, especially in a story like this, because, it's a third-person limited point of view, right? All this is, if we're thinking about this as being an eavesdrop, when you're eavesdropping, all you have are your senses, right? So mostly sound and sight. We don't have the privilege of being in these characters' heads and thinking, well, I'm saying this, but I think that, right? So all we really get is the dialogue on the page. Now, that can be tough to decipher whether a character is flat or round. The man seems maybe a little bit flat, but if you read the David Joss article, he's suggesting that he's a little bit more round, right? And he's, a lot of this, just the part of the article that's talking about Hemingway revolves around Hemingway's use of the word reasonably and how that sort of flies in the face of the third-person limited point of view because we get into the man's head for a very brief instant. So I'm going to read a little bit of the Joss article, and we'll get back to talking about whether the man is a static or dynamic or flat or round character. So the man drank an anise at the bar and looked at the people. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. Notice that word reasonably. This word violates the objective dramatic point of view. It tells us not just what the man sees, but the man's opinion about what he sees. In the context of their argument over the abortion, this word, unreasonably, implies that the man considers the woman unreasonable, unlike the people in the bar, and of course, unlike him. And then later on he talks about what this means to the complexity of the character. So if the man truly believes what he's saying, then he is a relatively complex or round character, someone whose behavior stems from self-delusion, not one-dimensional villainy, and the story immediately becomes too complex to evoke the simple responses of melodrama. So I think what he's saying is, he's not just, sometimes when we try to convince someone of something, we know in our heads that what we're trying to convince them of is not in their best interests. But I think that in this story, the man really does believe that it's in her best interest. He believes it's certainly in his best interest, and he seems to think, because of the use of the word reasonably and unreasonably, or the implication that she's unreasonable, that this is also in her best interest. So if we look at the David Joss article and view it in the context of the story, then maybe we have not quite a flat character for the man, but he becomes a little bit more round, right? Because in a way he's sort of deluded, right? Because it's not that he sees her and recognizes this really isn't best for her, but it's what I want. He really thinks that it's going to be the best for her. So he's shielded from things in a way. So I think that adds a little bit of complexity like the article suggests. Now, does he change? I would say probably not. He seems like a pretty static character, right? He goes into the story wanting her to have the abortion. At the end of the story, he wants her to have the abortion. Sure, there are some times when he says, excuse me, I really don't care what you want, you can do what you want, etc., etc. But there's still always that pressure that he really does want her to have the abortion. So I think that he's a pretty static character. So he might seem flat. I think he's a little bit rounder than we give him credit for when we first read the story. But I do think that he's a pretty static character. And now let's talk about Jig. Is she flat or round, static or dynamic? And again, maybe she strikes me as kind of a flat character. She doesn't want the abortion, and I think the reasons for that, are probably pretty obvious. I mean, it's her body. Maybe she wants a child. All of these sorts of things. But we don't, again, we don't have the privilege of being in her head. All we have are what we hear from her through the dialogue. And so, calling her a flat character isn't a dig against her. It's just that's all that we have. That's all the information we have to base her on. So I think she seems a little bit flat. And now, is she a static or dynamic character? And let's think about this question. When they leave the train station, eventually do you think that she's going to get the abortion or she's not going to get the abortion? And she seems to not want it now. And if you think she's going to get it in the future, so let's say she does get it in the future, does that make her a dynamic character? Obviously, her decision has changed, but I tend to think that that doesn't make her a dynamic character because, through the story, she seems kind of weak-willed, right? And so I think that although she would change her opinion from not wanting to have the abortion to having the abortion, she's still got this sort of intrinsic quality of being weak-willed and needing to do what the man says for her to do. And so in that way, I think that she's also kind of static. Even though her opinion about the abortion might change, nothing inside of her is really changing because I think that she's always, her opinions can always be shaped by other people. And that is a quality that she seems to have at the beginning of the story and continues to have at the end of the story. So I would say that she's mostly flat and mostly static.